Welcome. So, here's a puzzle for you. How can one single ancient verse point to three completely different saviors? I know, it sounds impossible, right? But that's exactly the mystery we're unpacking today. A single line of scripture that has fueled centuries of debate and shaped the faith of millions. I mean, that's a pretty wild question. How can the same exact words point to an 8th century Jewish king and to Jesus Christ and still hold a totally unique meaning for Latter-day Saints? We're going to get into all of it. Let's start digging into the different perspectives to see how this is even possible. All right, so to really solve this thing, we've got to go right to the source. The verse at the absolute heart of this entire debate comes from the Old Testament, from the book of Isaiah, chapter 9, verse 6. And here it is, from the classic King James Version. For unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulder, and his name shall be called Wonderful, Counselor, the Mighty God, the Everlasting Father, the Prince of Peace. Wow, you can just feel the power in those words, right? The language is so majestic, filled with these incredible, divine titles. It's really easy to see why it's captured so much attention. But the big question remains, who is this child? Well, it turns out the answer depends entirely on the lens you're looking through. Our source material breaks this down beautifully into three major traditions: Jewish, Christian, and Latter-day Saint. Now get this, each one looks at these exact same words but sees a completely different figure. So let's break down how this all works. Okay, first up, the Jewish interpretation. This reading is all about the original historical context, what was going on when Isaiah was actually writing, way back in the 8th century BCE. See, at that time, the kingdom of Judah was facing this massive threat from the Assyrian Empire. So in this view, the child born isn't some future divine being. No, it's a very human king, most likely King Hezekiah, who was a symbol of hope and deliverance for his people. So then what's the deal with all those divine titles? And this is where things get really interesting, because it all comes down to the original Hebrew. You see, the grammar can be read in a totally different way. Instead of the child being called all those amazing names, it can be read that God, the Wonderful Counselor, the Mighty God, is the one who calls the child's name Prince of Peace. In that reading, the divine titles refer to God, not the king. I mean, that's a game changer. It completely flips the meaning on its head. Now let's switch to the Christian ones. This interpretation reads Isaiah through the events of the New Testament. For Christians, this verse is seen as a direct, long-range prophecy of Jesus Christ. They use this method called typology, which is kind of like seeing foreshadowing of Jesus' life in these older texts. This view also leans on later translations, like the Greek Septuagint, which was an early Greek version of the Hebrew scriptures that phrases the verse in a way that points much more clearly to a divine child. And then the Latter-day Saint lens adds this whole other layer. It builds on the Christian reading, but it also brings in new revelation from the Book of Mormon. And this introduces a really fascinating concept called dual fulfillment. The idea here is that a prophecy isn't just a one-and-done thing. It can apply to its original ancient context, like King Hezekiah, and also point forward to Jesus Christ, and maybe even to events in our time. It's this really cool, multi-layered approach to prophecy. So, okay, we've got three very different readings. How do we even begin to compare them? Well, the source we're looking at lays out this really cool framework by separating the arguments into two distinct categories, the historical lens and the theological lens. And you'll see the authenticity of each view changes, dramatically, depending on which one you're using. Okay, first, let's look through the historical lens. You can think of this as the classic scholar's approach. It focuses strictly on what can be verified through historical evidence, the original Hebrew, the archaeology, and what the text most likely meant to the people who first heard it. The core assumption here, prophecy is all about the prophet's immediate world, not centuries later. And when you look at it that way, check out what happens. Through a purely historical lens, the Jewish interpretation scores highest for plausibility because it fits that 8th century context like a glove. The Christian and Latter-day Saint views, which depend on events far in the future, naturally score lower within this specific framework. But what happens if we switch lenses? Well, the theological lens works on a completely different set of rules. It's focused on divine intent, prophetic foresight, and God's grand plan throughout all of history. From this perspective, prophecy isn't just for the prophet's time. No, it's written with future generations in mind. And whoa, look at this. The scores completely flip. In a framework that prizes God's foresight across all of time, the Latter-day Saint view, with its idea of dual fulfillment, suddenly becomes the most coherent. The Christian view is also really strong, but the Jewish reading, which is designed to focus only on the history, naturally scores lowest on this theological scale. The big takeaway here, your starting point determines your conclusion. But hold on, we're not done yet. The source introduces one final and honestly pretty mind-bending argument that makes us go back and look at the whole historical dimension from a brand new angle. So here's the big what-if question that changes everything. What if we treat the Book of Mormon not as a modern text, but as an ancient historical witness? What happens to our analysis if we just run with that premise for a second? Well, according to the argument, if you do that, the whole historical equation just shifts. All of a sudden, the Latter-day Saint interpretation isn't some distant reading from the 19th century. Instead, it becomes historically robust because now it has a second ancient text backing it up. Here's how it works. In the Book of Mormon, around 600 BCE, a prophet named Nephi actually quotes this part of Isaiah and interprets it messianically. Now, if that text is ancient, it provides evidence that people were reading Isaiah this way long before Jesus was even born. It also suggests that this idea of dual fulfillment is an ancient way of reading Scripture, not a modern invention. And here's the kicker. The source revises its own historical score for the Latter-day Saint view, bumping it all the way up to a 40 out of 50. That's a huge deal. It puts it on the exact same level of historical plausibility as the Jewish interpretation, just based on a different textual foundation. It's a really dramatic shift in the analysis. So, where does all this leave us? Let's pull the historical and theological threads together for the final takeaway from our source material. When the source averages both lenses together, the historical plausibility and the theological coherence, this is what we get. The Latter-day Saint view edges out just ahead because it scores well in both categories. The Christian interpretation is right behind, also balancing both frameworks pretty well. And the Jewish view, while the strongest from that purely historical critical standpoint, is by its very nature more limited in the theological framework. So what's the ultimate conclusion? It's this. There is no single simple answer to which interpretation is the most authentic. Pure history points one way, pure theology points another. The answer you get is a direct result of the framework, the assumptions, the lens that you decide to start with. And that really just leaves us with one final thought. This whole exercise shows how powerfully our own lenses can shape what we see as truth. So it's probably worth asking yourself, what unseen lens, what set of assumptions shapes what you believe, not just about Scripture, but about everything? It's definitely something to think about. Thanks for diving into this with me.